What's up, everybody? So this is Albert. Those of y'all who know me, I graduated from Towson. Also graduated from Oxon Hill and from Prince George's County. He, him, his pronouns, and just want to start off by saying I'm very excited on what I'm trying to do. So, like a few weeks ago, I was thinking about doing an initiative, especially in this particular time because of all the uprisings that are happening to protest police and extinction violence. And I was thinking about going through some texts that focus on Black communities, the world we live in, and yeah, just get into understandings of the society we live in right now. So I think it'll be cool to like do some videos on analysis and on analyzing some revolutionary and Black radical texts that I've been exposed to, and anyone who has any recommendations, feel free to comment below or anything. So the first text that we're going to be looking over is Angela Davis's "Are Prisons Obsolete?" So perfect. First text says, considering there's a movement to defund the police and look into our prison systems and stuff like that. So what am I going to be doing is that I'm going to outline the highlights and through outline the Our Prisons Obsolete and talk about things that stuck out to me and give an analysis on how it's relevant to today and the call to action that I know Angela Davis will want us to do. So for those of you who don't know who Angela Davis is, what are you doing with your life? So she's a former Black Panther Party member. She was accused and she had her trial. For those of y'all who know about the video, she was found innocent, not guilty, and she um, does her call to actions by going into academic circles. She's an academic. She's a best-selling author, and is an activist still to this day. She's still going through conferences and talk about people about Black radical politics and extinction resistance that I think that needs to be heard. And excuse me. So this is a text that she wrote and published in 2003, so 17 years ago, and it's still relevant today. And as far as the history of the United States, you can present this text and it will be relevant and give you what needed to be said about the society we live in. So the book is not that long. It's 6 chapters. The PDF that I read, it was like 48 pages, but some text is like 120 something pages because it's a lot of information, but it's definitely something you can finish in one day, like I did. I finished it in one day. So chapter 1 is when she talks about prison reform or prison abolition. So when she began the text, she was talking about how there's this discourse on the death penalty, which states are talking about getting rid of because it's disproportionately unfair for certain communities, especially Black people. And people are wrongly convicted, as we know that there are, and people are on death row for crimes that they have not committed. They weren't even there when the scenes be happening. So there is an effort to get rid of the death penalty. And I know there are states that are actually got away with it and say that this is an unjust system. And then the conversation got into prisons. And Angela talked about throughout her life, like the prison industrial complex that she witnessed it, like how it began and how it progressed. So when she was studying prison, she noticed that there's an exponential increase in our prison systems. Like it doubles within a decade the amount of people that go to prison. And then she talked about women that are incarcerated and the gender analysis that are gone into mass incarceration, and talked about how prison abolition can be a feminist thing that can be done. And she also talked about how much we rely on prisons to function our economy. Like, we're living in a prison economy right now. We're built on an economy that's built off of cheap labor and free and cheap labor. So anything that is fueling the economy, the prison is literally a mechanism of our economy. And she talked about the normalization and sensationalism that goes within prisons, cops, and the institution of mass incarceration, like the cop shows that we be watching, the cop movies, articles that there gives like a propaganda that people need to be punished for their crimes, and there's no discussion on what we can do to help and uplift and empower those communities, giving them the resources that they need. But there's this message going around that community is bad and it needs to be punished. We need to put as many police officers as possible in that community, and that community is a cycle of violence that goes around in those communities. Like, there's a documentary called The Pruitt-Igoe Myth that I just saw some months ago. Talks about unfair housing, and it was a project to accommodate a black community, and I forgot what state it was, but it talks about the culture of poverty and how there's the lack of government support in that project leads to a lot of stealing, robbery, and stuff like that. It pretty much gives you what kind of the society we live in. And so Angela Davis wants us to envision a society without prisons. That's pretty much the drive of her work, of the prison industrial complex that we know about today. So chapter 2 is a history analysis on the prison. So she talks about slavery, the segregation and Jim Crow, and the prison system that we know today. So she talks about these racial caste systems that be happening within the United States. So slavery, for instance, that's literally built off the backs of enslaved people of African descent, and it makes things like cotton and stuff like that. And she also talked about how the abolition of slavery was seen as a radical ideology. So that also drove to her prison abolition politics. And she talked about the parallels with the prison system and slavery, how they're both based off of labor, and they're both based off of exploitation, and they're both based off of power dynamics. So the slave master, the slave patrols, and the slave. So we got police, prison guards, and prisoners. So she talked about how there are certain laws that the United States pushes to funnel slavery, mass incarceration, and so on and so forth. And then she went into segregation and lynching and lynchings. So talked about the racial violence of especially like the 1920s, where lynchings and race riots have been happening, Black Wall Street. So many of those things are the result of the policies that were put forth to make these communities crumble. And she talked about the history of the penitentiary system, which it's a lot of history behind that. Like it talks about religion and the Protestant reformations and stuff like that. So she spoke about how the penitentiary system is used as a reformation of slavery and the penal system, but at the same time it's still like an institution that focuses on the punishment of people, and how there's no rehabilitation for effective rehabilitation and economic mobility for people that are going through the penitentiary system. So even when you talk about prison reform, there literally were efforts to reform a system that's not built to support communities. So that's something that we can look at. And for y'all don't know, there are these things called the Black Codes that's been happening in the period between slavery and Jim Crow. So it's this Reconstruction era of policies that were going on after the Civil War, where freed slaves they had to face these laws called vagrancy laws. There's convict leasing, and it's literally policies where if you even think about refusing to do labor for me, you are doing even more labor and you're getting exploited even more. So Angela said this is even worse than slavery, because it's literally fuels industries like the coal mining industry. Like she talked about when she was in Alabama, because she comes from Alabama, a lot of people that she knows, they have families that work in coal mines, and that's based on the coal industry that the convict leasing era propelled. So that's another thing that can be talked about. And the convict leasing system also puts this criminalization on Black people. So for those of y'all that don't know, there were white people that pose as Black people, like they probably put makeup and stuff like that, like Jim Crow and stuff like that, and they pose and frame Black people. So it's easy to put Black people under the bus for crimes that they have not committed and actions that were extreme at that time. So that's leads into why there's this criminalization and people think Black people super predators or stuff like that, primitive savages that happened in the origins of colonialism. So we can get into that. And then Angela talked about the connection to prison labor and profit motive for corporations. So there are many corporations that work with prisons to get the products that they need, i.e. Walmart, i.e. Amazon. So a lot of products that are made in America are from prison labor. So we literally rely on the prison system for our economy, and there's literally needs to be reconciliation on what to do with that. And then she went into how there's this stigmatization of felons and ex-offenders. So when you're a felon or an ex-offender, there's a high chance you're going to go through a cycle of incarceration. So think about when you're a felon. There are a lot of jobs out there that don't even accept felons. Like there's a checkbox for when are you, or have you ever been arrested? Have you ever been convicted? Have you ever served a certain amount of time? When have you gone through maximum mandatory minimums is what I'm trying to say. So there's the lack of access to living wage employment, lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to mental health care services, lack of housing opportunities, and there's definitely a voter suppression that comes with being a felon because of that stigma. And I think it was the 2018 midterm in Florida. There were 3 million people that got their voter restoration restored because of because of there was a question on the ballot about restoring felons their right to vote. So so you can go on about the Voting Rights Act telling people to vote, but what if you're not eligible to vote and stuff like that? So that's very interesting that like you have to actually be aware of who you're telling to vote and give them the proper education on how to vote and stuff like that. So chapter 3 is imprisonment and reform. And Angela Davis said prisons can't be reformed. They're based off a social order of communities, and they're there to oppress. It's a system of oppression and exploitation that's based off an economy that exploits people for their labor, and there's nothing that can be reformed about it. And then she mentioned the gendered violence on women that's been going on in prison. So trigger warning, sexual assault and sexual violence will be mentioned in this video. So there's like prison sexual violence that's been happening. And then maximum security and solitary confinement. So those of y'all that don't know what solitary confinement is, when a prisoner is in a certain cell and they get their privileges of recreation activities cut out. They couldn't like watch TV or something like that, lack to the prison library or something like that. They get even a harsher punishment because they probably acted out, probably started a fight in the cafeteria or something like that, instead of being rehabilitated. And then she mentioned notable prison activist writers, Mamiya Abu-Jamal, who is still incarcerated to this day, and George Jackson. So for those of y'all that haven't heard about the Attica uprising in New York, I think, so there was an uprising, a prison riot, because there were prisoners that were filling out demands to the prison leaders about getting better treatment for probably work, better counseling, better cells so they can actually feel like humans. And then one thing led to another, and then there was a fight, and it was a few days of violence, bloody and gore that happened in the prison in Attica. So George Jackson, I think he died when the uprising finished, but he's a notable writer. He wrote some books, and he talked about his experiences in prison, which was very dehumanizing back then. Well, dehumanizing still to this day. And he also talked about efforts for prisoners to be educated so they can actually get opportunities to get a bachelor's degree or a master's degree while they're in prison. And after the uprising, there were efforts for prisoners to attend colleges and universities so they can get some education. And they know they want to be educated. They know that because they were living in a system that has a lack of education, they need to be exposed to opportunities to better themselves and get some empowerment from the education that they will get in colleges and universities. So even after that violence happened, the prisoners got what they wanted slightly, because not all of their orders were fulfilled, but they got something out of, even though it was a brutal few days in Attica. And chapter 4 is how gender structures the prison system. So you can't have a gender analysis. You can't talk about prison abolition if you can't have a gender analysis on it. So talks about sexual assault and drug manipulation that women prisoners go through. And there's this thing called internal search. So trigger warning, sexual assault. So it's when a prison guards, they strip and search and frisk a woman prisoner, and they even put their fingers on a woman's vagina. It's literally a violation of their body, and they had to consent to it, or they're just gonna punish them even more if they don't do the internal search. So it's literally like a cult that's going on in prison. Is literally a rape culture that's going on in prisons, and no one really knows about it. And there's this and women are most likely to be placed in psychiatric wards than men. Like, even though majority of prisoners are men, there's like a specific treatment that women experience when they enter the prison system. So the psychiatric wards, they're barely even helping the women. And there's this narrative there's no such thing as a fallen woman. There's no such thing as women having autonomy with their bodies. There's no such thing as women outside of the domestic stereotype. So that's a narrative that drives the policies in women in prison. And there's patriarchal practices that's literally women aren't treated as human beings when they enter the prison system. And it's like women can't make mistakes or anything. So there's a lot of women that are incarcerated off of murder of an abuser. So that's something to consider, how many women that are in prison because they assaulted or murdered someone who abused them. So there's also something to think about. And there's longer sentences for women than men. So, like, the narrative, why are women against the patriarchal standards? So you get punished even harder than men. So there's also a lack of resources in women prisons. So, like, women, their recreational activities aren't like sports or something that men get. It's like cooking or something like that. Cooking, knitting, even more labor. So that's something that's also to note. And then there's a lack of arson because they believe women aren't capable of resisting the treatments that they get. So there's this lack of arsenry that they feel that they don't have to worry about if there's a riot in a women prison. And then there's these escapee protocols. So when a prison guard spots someone who's escaping prison walls, they have to follow these certain standards. Like, if they yell out a prisoner saying "go back," they're legally allowed to shoot to injure. And if there's even more resistance from the prisoner, the prison guard is can legally shoot to kill. So it's really unfortunate that that's allowed. And you can parallel the experiences that women go through to women that go through slavery. So the rape and sexual assault is nothing new. Like, female slaves, they get raped and sexually assaulted from slave owners, and they even get pregnant off of rape and sexual assault, and they give birth to the slave owner's own child, and that even happens in prison, unfortunately. So it's this thing with, what about rapists getting incarcerated when it's that same system that protects rapists? So that's something that Angela Davis has drove attention to, that is literally prison abolition is a feminist, should be considered in feminist theory. And then chapter 5 is the prison industrial complex. So how multi-billion-dollar corporations, they benefit from prison labor, and there's literally nothing that can happen unless these corporations crumble. And there's a connection between the military industrial complex and the prison industrial complex. So thinking about why police have tanks to control these uprisings, thinking about Baltimore police, they had tanks when the uprising from Freddie Gray's murder happened. So that's another reason to defund the police when you see these movements. So, and there's also a connection between the border industrial complex. So immigration and detention centers, they get an exponential amount of money, and that in the prison industrial complex accommodates that industrial complex. So there's all these intersection of industrial complexes that be happening. You can even go into the pharmaceutical industrial complex and how it participates in that drug manipulation that I mentioned that happens to women. And all these commodities that come from prison labor, like Victoria's Secret, Walmart, all of these are economy. So it's literally like the United States has always functioned on this exploitation of labor since its founding, starting from slavery and a reformation of slavery through the prison system. And then there's the correlation of deindustrialization and the increase of privatization. So there's a lot of for-profit private prisons that are going around in this country. And that privatization and deindustrialization leads into an increase in poverty and lack of employment opportunities that funnel people into that prison system. So it's literally what the defund the police movement has called upon. So you need to defund these systems that are not benefiting communities and put into efforts that will actually help communities. So like free healthcare, free college, free mental health care. So endless things and policies that will decriminalize things like drugs and sex work. And then these corporations include Corrections Corporation of America, and that industry and the American Legislative Executive Council that the documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay mentioned, they have a lot of contracts with politicians, businesses, and universities like Walmart. I know in Towson, a lot of the furniture that was built from there has been made by Maryland Correctional Enterprises, and not even Towson. It's the University System of Maryland, and that's mandated by law to use the furniture because it's cheap. And then the text went into how the United States is literally a maximum security and a prison model for other countries. So it's not even a United States issue. It's literally a global issue. Like, I know this model has been followed in Australia and South Africa, as the text mentioned. So it's literally gives more reason and justification on why the prison system isn't really doing it for us. But yeah, it's literally a product of colonialism, and it's literally like a perpetrator of violence, a purveyor of violence that's approved by the state. And the final chapter, chapter 6, is abolitionist alternatives. So these are the solutions when you get rid of prisons that Angela Davis has proposed. So she called for the demilitarization of schools. So for instance, the school to prison pipeline, like think about it. We live in an institution that even punishes children, juvenile detention centers. Like a lot of these are children. They are navigating through life. Why are we punishing them? And it's probably like generational curses and lack of mental health treatments that these children never got exposed to, lack of academic achievements and stuff like that. And she also calls for free health and mental care. So when you defund the police, put that investment into universal health care, and people shouldn't have to worry about their lives even though they were put into it. They didn't ask to live and stuff like that. So there needs to be a government support of healthcare and mental health care. And those of y'all know there's decriminalization efforts of marijuana, for instance, and decriminalization of sex work. So there's a lot of prostitutes and prison system because they had interactions with police and stuff like that. And sex work is not the same as prostitution. Prostitution is an exploitative system based off favors when you is literally like a master slave operation that goes into prostitution. But sex work is when general sex work is sex workers that have autonomy with their bodies, and literally as long as you have responsible sexual health and explore your sexuality how you want to do it and be responsible about it, like destigmatization of HIV and AIDS and stuff like that. There should be no criminalization at all of that. And then there's investing in rehabilitation programs to help with people that are addicted to drugs and stuff like that, and free housing. So a lot of people result into crimes because of the lack of resources and the lack of programs that would have deterred them to crime. Employment, living wages and stuff like that. Like people couldn't afford products that are in these stores, which these riots that be happening, that's opportunities for people to get products that they couldn't have afford beforehand. So that's why they result to stealing and stuff like that. And food security. So those of y'all that don't know, food is, if you have access to healthy foods, that does a lot to your mental and physical health. So there's a lot of food banks around, and they need healthy foods to serve these communities. And covering that, you'll definitely see an instance in the decrease in crime. And then Angela Davis went into the concept of restorative justice and reconciliation and retribution. So she used the example of in South Africa during apartheid, there was this murder of this girl named Amy Beale. I think I forgot what race she was, but she was murdered by two men. And then the men, they spoke to the family of Amy Beale, they went through an accountability process and tried to do what they can to serve that family. So the family, they made a foundation in Amy Beale's honor because I think she was very well respected in the community. So the people that murdered her, they worked in that foundation and tried to teach future generations how to not resort to violence and stuff like that, which I think was very fascinating. Like that, I was never exposed to this practice until I read this text. So I think that's a good conversation to have. And I think it was Amy Beale's father that said, instead of simply reacting to violence, ask yourself, why do these terrible things happen? So getting into the root of the problem will stop all of these cycles that are generating harm to communities. So I think that's very fascinating. And there's a lot of quotes that I highlighted. I'll probably put them somewhere in the description box below or something. But yes, that's it. So I'm glad that everyone got to watch this entire video and watch my analysis, and I hope everyone learned something. So I know a lot of people don't have access to the language that I probably use, but if you had access to you see this video, you have access to Google, honey. So for real. But no tea, no shade. But I try my best to see if y'all got educated about the society that we live in, and you should have that duty to educate others as well. So I'm happy that everyone got to see this. So thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm definitely going to be doing another text, so I'm excited what will be next. And yes, feel free to recommend me any literature that y'all see that would be fascinating. There are a lot of articles, stuff out there that our ancestors wrote, and understood what kind of society we live in. So thank y'all so much. I'm very excited on what my initiative is going to try to do, and I hope y'all take care and have fun.